shall hear from our speaker, Dr. David Lawson, how a Sefer Torah on loan to his then synagogue, Kingston, from the Czech Memorial Scrolls Trust, inspired his interest into the background of that scroll and led him to research the history of Ostrava and its Jewish community in collaboration with the Jewish Museum in Prague, and to write a book on this subject. Now retired, he was a management consultant specializing in strategy, commercial and organizational effectiveness. After his presentation, David will be on hand to sign copies of his book, and next Tuesday we have guided tours lined up at the Czech Scrolls Memorial Museum.
Well, good evening. First of all, thank you all for coming out and avoiding the terrible debate on the television. Unlike both Boris and Jeremy, I was going to say I am not offering free handouts. However, following their tradition, there are some books for sale at the back with a slight discount because I get a discount as the author. So they're only £20 as opposed to 23, which is what Valentine Mitchell would normally charge you. Having said that, I can now thank Spencer for the introduction and Stuart Kurtz for introducing me to Spencer and for acting as a general PR man. So thank you both very, very much. Let's start with a question back to you. Does anybody here know anything about Ostrava? Have you even heard of Ostrava? Oh, good. More or less, no. Which means that you all started with the same degree of knowledge that I started about 15 years ago, which was, I'd never heard of the place. So let's start with geography. Imagine, if you will, a huge map of mainland continental Europe. Forget the little offshore islands. This is post-Brexit. And if you raise your right forefinger and stick it right in the middle of the map of continental Europe and look very closely at it, you'll find your finger is right on Ostrava. It is right in the physical center of Europe. Now, if the map is a modern political map, and you look closely, you'll see that Ostrava is 250 miles due east of Prague, right in the top right-hand corner of what is now the Czech Republic. Those of you who studied geography, northeast corner of the Czech Republic. About halfway in a straight line between Vienna and Warsaw. It's on the border of the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovakia, so right in the far corner. And there's a map of Europe with Ostrava. Now, if this is a physical map, and this really isn't very much of a physical map, and it's rather larger scale, you'll see that Ostrava sits on a river, well, so-called river. It's actually a very small stream, the Ostravica River, which flows east-west. And just outside Ostrava, it flows into the River Oder, which is flowing south-north into the Baltic. And you'll see, if it were a physical map, that Ostrava is surrounded by mountains to the west, north, and east. They're the sort of foothills of the Tatra Mountains. And the soil roundabout is pretty poor and gravelly, so Ostrava is physically a pretty insignificant place. And more importantly, historically, it's not on the road from anywhere to anywhere because it's surrounded by mountains. So you wouldn't go through Ostrava more or less wherever you were going. And particularly if you were an army, you wouldn't go anywhere near Ostrava because it's a damn nuisance to get into and out of. And when you got there, there was nothing there anyway. So it's a nothing very much. The only relevant bit about it at this stage is that it's part of the great Austro-Hungarian Empire. And within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the river Ostravica, which goes through the middle of Ostrava, is the border between Moravia on the left south bank and Silesia on the north bank, which immediately brings us to some sort of geographic problems in terms of description. I will use Ostrava to mean generally what is nowadays called Greater Ostrava, so it includes all the surrounding little villages and areas, and it's quite a large place. Originally, Ostrava was split into two. There was the Silesian part of Ostrava on the Silesian part of the river, and Moravian on the other bank. But it was really a pretty insignificant place. Nothing very much ever happened in Ostrava, which leads obviously to a question of, well, if nothing ever happened and it's on the road to nowhere and nowhere, why the hell should you be interested? And even more, why on earth should I be interested? I'm not a geographer, I'm not a historian, and I'm not Czech. What's the story then? Well, as all good Jewish stories, it starts in the beginning. Because, as we heard, Kingston, Surbiton and District Synagogue, a united synagogue south of the great River Thames, there are Jews south of the river, has a Sefer Torah on loan from the Czech Memorial Scrolls Trust, which came from Ostrava, and it came with a certificate, which one of our members, when I inquired about it, said, I'm sure I've got it somewhere in a box under my bed, I'll try and find it for you, and he duly did. Now, you probably can't see, but it says right at the bottom that scroll 129, the number from the Memorial Scrolls Trust, comes from Moravska Ostrava and in brackets Marish Ostral. And when we started, several of us looked at each other and said, first of all, where the hell is Ostrava? And what on earth is one Sefer Torah doing coming from apparently two separate places, Moravska Ostrava and Marish Ostral? Which again demonstrates our complete ignorance, because you will probably have twigged by now that Moravska Ostrava is the Czech version of what the Germans called Marish Ostral, the side of Ostrava on the Moravian side of the border. So our Sefer Torah apparently comes from the Moravian side of Ostrava. And there is our Sefer Torah in use. It isn't technically in use. This is a posed picture with our then rabbi, David Mason, presently the rabbi of Muswell Hill, looking rather younger than he does nowadays. So that's the background, and that's why I'm interested. So you're going to get a sort of three-part story. The first is the story of Ostrava. The second, which is very much smaller part, is our research and some of the results we got from our research. And the third bit is an introduction to the Czech scrolls. Now, you're going next week to see the museum, so I won't steal too much of their thunder. But our scroll comes from the Czech Scrolls Trust, so the two are bound together, and it provides an introduction to why the Czech Scrolls Museum and Trust exists. So we start our research, knowing nothing at all about it, but with an assumption that Ostrava, being in the middle of nowhere doing nothing, is rather like Anatevka, and there are fiddlers sitting on the roof and chickens running up and down the main street and all that sort of stuff. And that's where we started from. And in fact, if you go back to the middle of the 19th century, you can see it actually doesn't look all that far off Anatevka. This is an 1855 lithograph, and it's a nice country town. It is actually a small market town because it's on the border between Moravia and Silesia, so there's a little market. And actually this interesting small fact becomes very, very interesting and important, because Ostrava, being a market town on the border between Moravia and Silesia, immediately gives it a different air. There is some sort of mingling of people on that side and people on this side. More importantly than that, Moravia, Ostrava, is in the frontier of the Slavs to the north and east, and the Romance Germanic lot to the south and west. So it is a sort of melting pot by its geography, and that, I think, is a very important part, which we will come back to as we talk about Ostrava. Now, if we go back to the middle of, well, even the middle of the 18th century, so 1750 odd, Ostrava totally insignificant, and from my perspective and your perspective, much more importantly, there are absolutely no Jews in Ostrava. Jews were forbidden to spend the night in Ostrava. So any Jews who actually wanted to trade with Ostrava had to come in and go out during the day. So totally Judenrein, as many places in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were. The total population in, well, actually 1772 of the area now called Greater Ostrava was fewer than 3,000 people and approximately no Jews. Jump forward 150 years to 1932, the population of Ostrava is now 225,000, and somewhere between 8 and 10,000 Jews. Now, however hard the Ostravans tried, that is not a natural increase in population. To go from 3,000 to 225,000 in 150 years, no, something has happened. Well, clearly what's happened is there's been mass immigration into Ostrava. And given that I've already said there's nothing very much in Ostrava, why would anybody want to emigrate into Ostrava? What's the big attraction? Well, two things happened towards the end of the 18th century. And I think they're probably connected. The first one is that hard black coal was discovered in and around Ostrava. So suddenly the Industrial Revolution happens. Ostrava becomes the center of coal, iron, and steel manufacture in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Emperor Joseph II issues the first of a series of edicts of tolerance, which allow non-Catholics in his dominions to move into areas from which they were previously barred and to enter trades and professions from which they were previously barred. So suddenly Ostrava has a huge economic potential and a need for people and the opportunity for people to move in. So they do. Now, depending on which sort of historian you read, Joseph was either a very enlightened emperor or a mercenary so-and-so who sat there thinking, why the hell have we got all these Jews and Catholics just loafing around doing nothing and contributing nothing to the imperial exchequer? Why don't we let them do some work so we can tax the so-and-sos? I tend to prefer the second story because it rings rather truer to me, but perhaps he was enlightened as well. However, I do get a clue from the introduction to the first edict, which reads, "As it is our goal to make the Jewish nation useful and serviceable to the state, mainly through better education and enlightenment of its youth, as well as by directing them to the sciences, the arts, and the crafts, we hereby grant and order." So he had got economic benefits in mind. So the Industrial Revolution is beginning to happen. Jews can move in, and things suddenly boom, and Ostrava becomes an economic powerhouse. Interestingly, the first ever coal mine in Ostrava, and the first iron furnace was set up not by a Jew, but by the Archbishop of Olomouc, because he was the local archbishop covering the whole area, and Ostrava was part of his dominion. And he was a very commercially minded sort of bloke, so he set up the mines and the ironworks. Later, the Gutmann brothers, who were both Jewish, started out by being transport people, and they were transporting the coal from the coal mines to the blast furnaces, then bought into the coal mines and later bought into the ironworks as well. So the Gutmann brothers, being Jewish, became big in coal, iron, and steel, and they joined forces with another Jewish family of whom you've possibly heard, the Viennese Rothschilds. So the Rothschilds ultimately bought out the Gutmanns, so the Rothschilds owned the whole iron, coal, steel area. So Ostrava suddenly boomed and looked like a species of hell. And people that I've spoken to who remember Ostrava from before the war, perhaps not quite in 1911, looked at that and say, yeah, that's what it looked like. Ostrava was the home, apparently, of the black polka dot shirt. And I said, I hadn't realized a textile industry there. And they said, well, actually, there was a little textile industry, but you really don't understand. You went out in the morning with a white shirt, and by lunchtime, you had a black polka dot shirt because of that. So Ostrava grew. Ostrava grew. And as it grew, they discovered more and more coal mines. Heinz Vogel, who was a little lad, presently is aged about 90, living in Canterbury, remembers the photograph being taken outside his family flat in the center of Ostrava, next to a coke works and a slag heap. And he points out that this was not a slum. His family were good middle-class people with a very, very nice flat in Ostrava, and that was immediately outside their front door. So we've got coal, iron, and steel. The place is booming, and it's filthy and pretty disgusting. Let me ask you another question. What do you think the occupation of the first Jewish immigrants into Ostrava was? Tailors? Any other suggestion? No? I would have guessed tailors, possibly doctors, but tailors or peddlers. Actually, the major occupation of Jewish migrants into Ostrava, to start with, they were brewers, distillers, and innkeepers. In fact, in 1786, there's a lease for a hostelry signed in Hebrew by Abraham Hoshek. And you can see his signature in Hebrew, and somebody, not him, has written it in Czech underneath. And this is 1786, which I think confirms that even very, very early on, because Ostrava was full of immigrants, all of whom had moved in to try and make a living, so everybody accepted everybody else was trying to make a living, and they were therefore very tolerant of each other, because if you're trying to make a living from everybody round about, the last thing you want to do is to have a row with them because they're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, come from here or there or whatever. So everybody is tolerant, and they accept a Hebrew signature on a lease. George Roden, who will appear much later on in our story, who's also quite elderly by now, told me that, yes, he remembers his grandmother used to sell spirits in the centre of Moravska Ostrava, and he told me where his grandma's place was. And when I visited Ostrava for the first time, I found it. It was then the Irish pub in the centre. Later, of course, more Jews moved in. So as well as brewers and distillers, you had shopkeepers, Jewish department stores, bankers, lawyers, doctors, architects, jewelers, even a producer of 4711 Eau de Cologne was a Jew and had a factory and a distribution. There were artists, fine artists, musicians, timber merchants, politicians, national diplomats, photographers. Within 4 years of Monsieur Daguerre in Paris demonstrating daguerreotypes, in Ostrava they had a commercial photographer. Now, Ostrava is quite a long way from Paris, and in 4 years they'd already had a commercial photographer. But alcohol and hospitality was very much a Jewish occupation, right up to the Second World War. A quotation. On the street of the 28th of October, between the Palace Hotel and the Sikora Bridge, for instance, there were 83 Jewish stores and only 28 Czech ones. On the then Velika Ulica, the main street, is said to have housed 24 Jewish shops and 5 Czech ones. Out of 360 hotels, wine bars, and coffee houses in Ostrava, approximately 100 were in Jewish ownership. Out of 98 Czech doctors, 25 were Jewish. And among 82 German doctors, that is German-speaking doctors, there were 63 Jews. Of 112 lawyers, 70 were Jewish at the time of the German occupation. Now, having read that, I will give you a health warning, because this is a quotation from a book by Richard Drapala, who used to be the city archivist, so you would assume he knows what he's talking about. When I first went to Ostrava, I met the then city archivist, a lovely, lovely lady, who said, do not believe a word that the Drapala said about anything. She didn't actually say he's a fascist, anti-Semitic bastard, because she was a lady. But she described him in words that translated very roughly into, he's an anti-Semitic bastard and don't believe a word he says. The city of Ostrava fired him because he was. This was just before the war. However, Jews from Ostrava to whom I have spoken subsequently said, well, we don't know whether those numbers are correct, but the qualitative picture is absolutely true. Jews played a major, predominant role in the economic, commercial, artistic life of Ostrava. And if the numbers are wrong, they're only wrong slightly. So the qualitative picture is true. So Jews are very, very important in Ostrava. So let's come on to sort of Jewish life, particularly. Move on to 1860. The Kultus Verein, which is a sort of Jewish association, was set up in Silesian Ostrava, that's the east side of the river, by one Shimon Frankel, who was a brewer and distiller, described by people who knew him as arrogant, self-opinionated, domineering, and frum. A combination of qualities not entirely unknown even nowadays. So he set up the Jewish Association in Silesia and actually set up the first Stiebel in a room above his distillery, which always seemed to me to be a great place to daven Ne'ilah. He also, in his spare time, was the Moel, and one of his clients was one Sigmund Freud. Now, what effect having a bris performed by an arrogant, self-opinionated, domineering, frum brewer had on young Sigmund, I don't know, but I'll leave to your imagination. Whether it influenced his subsequent career, you can guess. Anyway, the association has been set up, and then in 1872, cholera strikes, and poor Mrs. Fanny Reicher is the first victim. And she now has to be buried, of course. And there isn't a cemetery in Ostrava. The Jewish cemetery is in Cieszyn, which is about 30 miles away. Except the local medical officer said, there's cholera. If you think you're taking a victim from here to Cieszyn, 30 miles through the country, you've got another thing. Terribly sorry, she's not going anywhere. So poor Mrs. Reicher had to be buried in the Protestant cemetery. Then things really got serious because Mrs. Bertha Rice got cholera and died. Now, she was the granddaughter of Mordechai Schönhoff, who was the big macher in the Jewish community. So something had to be done. And something was done. Marcus Strassmann, who was now the landlord of the local town brewery, and Joachim Kafka, who is described as a businessman, bought a couple of fields on the road to Troppau, or Opava, depending which language you want to talk about, and set up a cemetery. And there's the original shed. They raised the princely sum of 4,000 florins, the equivalent at the time of £352 sterling. And when I did the calculation in 2006, £352 sterling was the equivalent of £14,500. They raised it in a couple of days, which gives you some idea of the size and wealth of the Jewish community. And there it is. The building on the left is where the horses lived, and the building on the right is the OL. And on the 7th of December 1872, official permission was received for the cemetery, and the unfortunate Mrs. Rice was the first person to be buried there. At this point, there was a huge ferribble. Of course, they're Jews. Shimon Frankel, you remember, had set up the association, Jewish association, on the right bank of the river in Silesia. Most of the Jews at this time were living on the left bank in Moravia, and they wanted the association and the centre of Jewish life to be on the left bank. He wanted it to be on the right bank. Harumph! In 1875, the matter was resolved with the official Kultus Gemeinde, the official state authorized Jewish community set up in Moravian Silesia on the left bank. And Frankel took umbrage and disappeared from our story. But Ostrava now produced 6 shuls, not quite as good as Edgware perhaps. There's the cemetery in 1920. It doesn't exist. It was flattened in 1980 to make way for a park. There is the main shul, built in 1879. It housed 700 male worshippers. I'm not sure how many women because it wasn't specified, but I guess about 700 ladies. And this, as you can see, is a postcard. So somebody in Ostrava thought it worthwhile to sell picture postcards of the shul in Ostrava as a commercial enterprise. That's the inside, a photograph, not a very good photograph, of the inside of the shul. So in Ostrava, there were 6 shuls, 4 very large and grand, rather like this one. One of them rather small and pokey. The back half of the building was a flat where the rabbi lived, and this half was actually the shul. The rabbi there was a Rabbi Forscher, and some of you might know the Rabbi Forscher's family, who subsequently came to the UK. The original Rabbi Forscher was sent to Ostrava by the Bobova Rebbe to be the Rabbi Chasen Shochet, I presume Shamas as well, but who knows. And those are 2 of his daughters, and his granddaughter, Ruth, whom I knew and met, said that her aunts, these 2 ladies, girls, remember the photograph being taken because it was clearly quite a big event in their life. A couple of entertaining side stories. Rabbi Forscher, as I said, was sent to Ostrava by the Bobova Rebbe, and he was taught Chazanut in Ostrava by the choirmaster of the Ostrava Opera, who wasn't Jewish. That shul also no longer exists. All the shuls were destroyed in 1939. And Ruth came back with us on a trip back to Ostrava to see where her grandpa lived. And we found the site, which is now a petrol station. And I have a memory of Ruth standing in the forecourt of the petrol station with tears pouring down her eyes because this was where her family came from. So 6 shuls, a couple small, but 4 of them really large and grand. But before the shul had been set up, in 1863, a Jewish school was set up. And I always show that because I think it's a fabulous picture. The class of 1898. It's only girls in the photograph, but there were boys there as well. The school continued from 1863 until 1942, when it closed for all sorts of reasons, not least of which there were no Jewish children anymore in Ostrava. But as well as shuls and a school, there was a hospital in the Rothschild Steelworks, a better hospital in the steelworks, in the Rothschild Steelworks, than the local municipal hospital. There was a Jewish old people's home, a Jewish apprentice training school, and a home for the apprentices to live in, and a children's holiday home on the banks of the Ostravica River. And the building is still there, although it doesn't look quite like that. There were sports clubs and social clubs. Ostrava was a technically very advanced place. It had electric trams before London did. It was culturally and socially advanced. It had opera houses. It's been done up since, and it's a fabulous, fabulous opera house, a little gem, quite small, 500 people inside. And although I don't have a very delicate or critical ear, when I went to an opera there, I reckon it was at least as good as anything I've heard at Covent Garden. And it cost me a £5 for the best seats. And that's the inside of it. Not a very, very good photograph, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like. There were decent hotels where decent middle-class Jewish ladies could take tea and cakes, and their husbands could drink something slightly stronger and play cards and gossip. There were department stores. Ostrava was the center of the Zionist movement in the area, Czechoslovakia and Silesia. The International Maccabeah Games was held in Ostrava in 1920. In fact, people that I speak to say, when I ask them about anti-Semitism, they look at me as if I were completely delirious and say, there wasn't any. Until towards the middle of the 1930s when it spilt over from the Sudetenland into Ostrava. But Ostrava itself was more or less entirely free of it, tolerant, enlightened, and just let everybody get on with whatever they were doing. It was a pretty good civil society. Until, that is, on the 14th of March, 1939, the day before the Germans invaded Prague, they occupied Ostrava. And the decent, civilized, enlightened, tolerant life came to an end. In May and June, all the shuls, one after the other, were burnt down. Usually in the middle of the night, and the local fire brigade rushed to the scene to put out the fire, which was all reported in the newspaper the following day, that sadly all the buildings were burnt down, but the fire brigade had managed to save the buildings next door, and nobody was hurt, but it's just the shuls were all destroyed. The story is slightly more complicated because one of my colleagues, a very determined old lady who lives in Ostrava, followed up the story and went to the fire brigade and went through their archive and found written evidence that the fire for at least one of the shuls was set by the fire brigade, because instructions apparently from the fire chief to the fire brigade was, look, if there's a serious fire, whatever time of day or night it is, you come and get me. I'm the boss and I've got to be there. So in June, early in the morning, they went round to get him to say, the shul in Vitkovitz is on fire. So he jumped out of bed and started to get dressed, and they said, don't rush, because the fire hasn't really got going yet. So when he did get dressed slowly, and they went round to see the fire, which was still not going very well, they had to smash all the windows to get the fire going properly so they could then put it out properly. So the fires were set by the fire brigade, obviously under orders, and then put out. Which raises an interesting and obvious question, because I started the discussion with, we have got a Sefer Torah that came from Ostrava, and I showed it to you, and it's obviously not burnt. Well, how does that come about? If there's a fire and all the shuls are burnt down, what's going on? Well, there is a bit of a mystery. Clearly, somebody warned somebody that there is going to be a fire. Clearly, the fire brigade knew there was going to be a fire because they were told to set it. At Ostrava being a very tolerant, enlightened, friendly place, presumably somebody in the fire brigade told somebody somewhere, if I were you, I'd take all the stuff that's important out of the shul because it probably won't be there tomorrow morning. Now, we know this sort of thing happened because several people have said, we were at home one night when the doorbell went, and one of my pals turned up and said, are you still here? I wouldn't be here tomorrow morning if I were you. So warnings were issued and acted upon. Side story. You all know of Oskar Schindler, of course, and Schindler's List. Do you know of the Gleiwitz incident in September 1939, just before war broke out, just before the Germans moved from Czechoslovakia into Poland? The Germans thought they needed a casus belli. Why are they going to invade Poland? So they invented an excuse. They got several prisoners, German prisoners, and dressed them in Polish army uniforms, and then killed them. They then pretended to attack a radio post, a German radio post, near Ostrava, and left the dead bodies of the prisoners wearing Polish army uniforms nearby to prove that the Poles had attacked the Germans. The uniforms, Polish army uniforms, had been almost certainly provided by Oskar Schindler, who at the start of the war was a member of the Nazi Party and an actual active spy. He was not at that point a member of the righteous among the Gentiles. He was later, but at the time he was a traitor, and an active traitor. So, just before September 1942, in September 1942, just before Yom Kippur, the first transport of Jews from Ostrava to Theresienstadt. The day before, in fact, they arrived the day after Yom Kippur in Theresienstadt. By Simchat Torah, most of them had been murdered. Of the 8,000 to 10,000 Jews in Ostrava in 1939, by 1945, fewer than 300 returned, and there were perhaps 100 or 200 who had managed to get out. The rest had been murdered. No, we'll come on to that. And I will mention at this point Elsa Weber, who was a well-known Czech poetess, writer, came from Ostrava, born Elsa Hellinger, fell in love with Willem Weber, and told her mum, I'm going to marry Willem. And mum said, oh, Basseltoft, does he know? Oh, no, she said, I'm going to tell him soon. They did get married, and they had 2 children, Tommy and Janusz. In 1939, Ilse decided that it would be a good idea if the 2 boys were sent to London to a friend of hers who was a Swedish diplomat who was then posted to London. Tommy, however, was ill, so couldn't travel, so Janusz went himself to London. Willem and Ilse and Tommy were shipped off to Theresienstadt, and then all shipped off to Auschwitz. Ilse and Tommy were murdered. Willem survived. While in Theresienstadt, Ilse wrote a poem. She was a poet, addressed to her son Janusz in London. And she hid it in the cavity in the wall somewhere in Theresienstadt. And incredibly, her poetry survived and was discovered, and incredibly made its way back to Willem, then living in Sweden, who had them translated and published, which is how I come to know about it. Now, the poem written by Ilse, entitled Letter to My Son, previously when I gave this talk, I tried to read part of it, and I failed because I broke down after about 3 lines, so I'm not even going to try. But at the end of the talk, there is the poem on the screen, and I have a copy. And I think somewhere in the office here in Edgware, there are other copies, so you can try reading it yourself. So let's move on to post-war, where in 2009, there was a memorial conference organized in Ostrava to commemorate the Jews who were deported. And I was invited to the conference, which was very nice of them, although not very much help because it was all in Czech. But one of my colleagues did a running translation of some of the key bits, including a talk right at the end by the director of, or dean of, Ostrava University, a lady who stood up and said, actually, my grandmother was murdered in Auschwitz. And went on to say, you know, there's something the matter with Ostrava nowadays, there's something lacking. What's lacking? Well, it doesn't have the sparkle, the dynamism, it's dull, it's grey, it's boring. What's missing is the Jews. Her words, not mine. Which brings me, I suppose, to the theme of my research into Ostrava. And I mentioned there were artists, one of whom rejoices under the name of Yehuda Bakon. He is Jewish. And he produced a picture escaping from the fire with a Torah scroll. And when I met Yehuda, who lives in Jerusalem, and said, what's the inspiration? He said, well, of course, at the end of the war, I was still alive, and I got out of Ostrava, and I'd survived the camps, and I had literally nothing. The only thing I had was a memory of being Jewish, hence escaping from the fire with a metaphorical Torah scroll. Which brings me back to the Kingston Torah. How did we get it? We've got it. It comes with a certificate, so we know where it came from. How? Well, the first of the three halves of the Ostrava scroll story, you know the story of Ostrava, the shuls. Of course, they've got Sifrei Torah. Let's leave out the middle half and go to the third half, which starts in 1964 with Erik Estorik, an art dealer who was in the Czech Republic buying and selling art, and particularly buying art. Now, I like to imagine, and this is pure poetic license on my part, I like to imagine this happened one grey February evening in a gents' toilet in Prague. It didn't. That is purely me making up the story. But at some point, one of his contacts in Prague said, "You're Jewish, aren't you, Erik?" And he said, "Yes, why?" "Do you want to buy a job lot of Sifrei Torah? Because we've got some." "What do you mean you've got some?" "We've got a whole pile. Do you want them?" "I'll tell you what, I'll take you." Now, this is 1964, the height of the Cold War. So Erik gets into the car with this guy and drives off into the suburb of Prague. And in 1964, the suburbs of Prague were no place for Western persons to be. And Erik must have been thinking, is this wise? Anyway, they arrived at what was the Michler Shul, had been turned into a warehouse. And they went in, and the guy opened the door, and there was a heap, literally, of Sifrei Torah. And the guy said, "No, do you want to buy them, or don't you want them?" And Estorik said, "Well, I'll have to go back and ask some of my colleagues." So he went back and asked Ralph Yablon, who was a member of Westminster Shul, which is where Westminster comes into the story. And he said, "Well, of course you want to buy them. Here's 25 bob, go and buy them." Now, there's some discussion about exactly how much they were bought for. Something like $10,000 US, we think. But there's a debate about what currency it was in and exactly what the number was. But the net result was 1,564 scrolls came back to Westminster Shul in 1964. Now, before the actual purchase was effected, Yablon said, "Well, we better check that this is really okay." So they sent out Shimon Abramsky, whom some of you might know. He was an expert in Judaica and ancient documentation, used very much by Sotheby's or Christie's or even both. And he went out and looked at them and said, "Yeah, it's all okay." So they were bought and came back 1964. And I actually remember them arriving in Westminster Shul because at the time I was a student at Imperial College, which is just down the road. And I used to go to Westminster Shul very occasionally to remind myself that I really am Jewish. So I remember them. And I remember seeing a heap, literally, of scrolls in the main hall of the shul. They're slightly better displayed now than they were then. So that's how the scrolls sort of arrived in London, and they were then, at least the kosher ones, were sent out on permanent loan to communities all over the world, including to Kingston, which is how we came by ours. There's obviously a little gap in this story, which is the second half, because the first half has got scrolls in Ostrava in the shul. The second half has got scrolls in Prague, 250 miles away. What happened? How did they get there? There's a war on, don't forget. Well, there is still a mystery in the middle of all this, but there is some bits we know. One of the things we know is that in 1942, the Jewish community in Prague, which still existed, and was given de jure jurisdiction over all the communities in Bohemia and Moravia by the German authorities. So the Jewish community in Prague was the center. In 1942, they sent two letters out, first in May and the second, I think, in August, to all the communities in Bohemia and Moravia, saying in August, send, and in May, you're going to have to get together and send all your Jewish material and artifacts, pack them up and send them to Prague for safekeeping. And you'll need 4 lists, 1 list for you, 1 list you'll send in advance for us, and 2 lists you'll pack with the stuff and you send. Now, I saw the list of stuff that was sent from Ostrava. It ran to 6 typed A4 sides. That is a lot of stuff. There were 15 Cifre Torah sent, and candelabra and books and curtains and all sorts of things. That's 250 miles in 1942. There's a war on. Now, okay, the Germans are winning, but there's still a war on. You can't do this without somebody noticing. So somewhere, somehow, the German authorities must have said, okay, do that, that's a good idea. And this is where it gets very, very confused. The best explanation that I have come across is that the German bureaucracy, of course, was complicated, and there were at least 2 organizations responsible for Jewish things. There was the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung und Treuhandstelle. These were the people who Aryanized businesses and fixed property. So they took over your house, your business, and big stuff. And then the Gestapo and the Zollfahndungsstelle got involved because they said, well, stuff that's movable, so bits and pieces, jewelry and the like, that's us. And then there was a big argument. And the Jews in Prague had helped compound this by initially suggesting to the Germans that as the Germans initially had left shuls and Jewish communities alone, more or less, that they needed religious artifacts, they needed Cifre Torah and so on. And these things were religious, so of no great value. So nobody was particularly interested if they're of no value. Later on, when it became obvious that things were getting a bit serious, the story changed to actually some of them are actually of historical value. So they're not just artifacts of religious value, but they are of intrinsic historical or intrinsic value if they're silver items. So suddenly everybody wants to grab hold of these, and there was a big row between the 2 German organizations. We want them, no, you want them, we want them, no. And at this point, the Jewish community in Prague effectively said to the German senior authorities, look, why don't we just look after them a while here in Prague, while you lot sort out what you're going to do with them. Meanwhile, we'll look after them. And they'll be here, they'll be in Prague. So that was decided upon, which is how, in theory at least, they all came to Prague. Interestingly, the Jewish Museum in Prague continued to function during the war. It did not close, which is incredible. And in 1942, when all this stuff started to arrive from all over the place, they recruited people to catalogue what was going on. So they recruited, I can't even remember, Dr. Jakobowicz, the uncle of the late chief rabbi, who was the librarian of the Prague Jewish community. He was recruited to help catalogue, and they recruited other Jewish museum experts to come and catalogue all these artifacts. When all the cataloguing had been done, they were all shipped off to Auschwitz and murdered, of course. However, they were all catalogued, and I've actually seen the accession card for scroll 129, which is in Kingston. So it describes the scroll, its dimensions, and where it came from. So 1962-3, the Czechoslovak authorities offered all this stuff to the Israeli government for sale. Now, the Israeli government had obviously better things to do with their money and other things on their minds than Czech material, even if it was of great value. So nothing happened. So Esterich was offered it. And according to my note, US dollars 30,000, about £10,000 sterling, for 1,564 Cifre Torah, not all of which were kosher. And they are now, well, some of them are still in Westminster. The rest are throughout the world, including one in Tuscaloosa, which apparently is 800 years old and the second oldest known complete Sefer Torah. So let's close our talk with another drawing by Yehuda Bakon, which is a portrait of his father in the smoke of the crematorium in Auschwitz. And although you can't see, the bottom right-hand corner is the time and date of his murder. And at that point, I shall finish my talk, except to point out that at the back of the room, there are lots and lots and lots of copies of the book. Anybody who would like a copy at the remarkable bargain price of £20, help yourself. And I shall try and answer any questions if there are any.
Yes, yeah, quite a lot of the photographs you had German comment on them.
Yes.
Like the one of the cemetery had Friedhof on the bottom, which is German for a cemetery. Is there a reason for that if it's in Czechoslovakia?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, there is a very, very good reason. The vast majority of the Jewish population of Czechoslovakia, even in 1939, were German-speaking. They all could speak Czech by then, but their first language was almost exclusively German. And Ostrava itself, until the establishment of Czechoslovakia in 1919, was probably 50-50 German-speaking and Czech-speaking. And until 1939, there were German language schools in Ostrava. There were German language doctors, lawyers, shops. So German was still used as an everyday language, even in the late 1930s. And the Jews almost entirely spoke German. German, not Yiddish.
How did this Sefer Torah get to the Westminster Synagogue, and where does the Westminster Synagogue come into the story rather than perhaps offer them to the chief rabbinate or Beth Din or anything like that?
Oh, it's pure, well, not coincidence. Eric Esterick knew Ralph Jablon. I presume he had sold material to Jablon, and Jablon was a member of Westminster Synagogue. So when Jablon provided the money for the purchase of the scrolls, it was on condition they came to Westminster. And at the time, Rabbi Reinhardt, the rabbi of Westminster Shul, said, that would be fantastic. Yes, of course they can come here, and we have physically the space to deal with it, which is how it arrived. Pure chance.
Has anyone else undertaken research like you've done on any other towns?
Yes, Pinner Reform, I think, have got a sefer that comes from, pass, the name escapes me, but they have done even more research than we have. Liberal. Northwood Liberal, yes.
When you went to Ostrava, what did you actually see there? I mean, in other words, who was there?
Thank you. Yes, when I first went to Ostrava, what did I see? What was there? The answer is, in terms of Jewish things, almost nothing. There is no physical Jewish trace. There was, at the time, a plaque outside where the main shul used to be. Subsequently, the plaque was removed. Somebody thought it was valuable for scrap metal. It actually wasn't, but it disappeared. So a new memorial has been put up. But in terms of physical things, there is nothing. All the shuls were destroyed and flattened. The Jewish school site is still there, but the building also has been knocked down. There is a small Jewish community, and although all the shuls have been knocked down, there was a Zionist office for the Zionist organization. And that was taken over by, I think, the Gestapo and then handed back to the Ostrava Jewish community, and they've turned it into a sort of stiebel, which is at least in theory usable, although I'm not quite sure whether it is in fact ever used, but it's there as a stiebel. And it has interestingly, you mentioned an Oren Kodesh. They have a very old Oren Kodesh, and I asked, where did it come from? Because it clearly wasn't part of the building. And they said, that's an interesting question. Somebody hid it. Well, who hid it? I mean, it's an Oren Kodesh. It's not something you can sort of put under the bed. Who hid it? And we can't remember. No. Anyway, there is a very small community. There were then about 200 members. To what extent they are all halakhically Jewish, I really wouldn't like to say, but my guess is not very many of them. And most of them don't originate in Ostrava, but Ostrava became the center for roundabout. And if you could plausibly claim to be Jewish and be in Ostrava, Ostrava received compensation from the German government. So the Ostrava Jewish community and the so-called survivors have got some support from the German government, which is better than not having support from the German government. So there's incentives to go there. There were a couple of people who survived. One of my contacts sadly has died earlier this year, Misha Salomonovitz, who was born in 1932, so he was about 7 when the Germans occupied. He lived through the Łódź ghetto, Auschwitz, Dresden, the firebombing, a death march. And he lived through it all, then went back to Ostrava, so lived through the communist era. When I first met him, he stood 2 meters tall, thick grey hair, clear blue eyes, claimed not to speak English, but said speak German. His German was perfect. When my German packed up after about 3 minutes, he suddenly discovered that he could actually speak a bit of English. So he was there and had survived. His wife, not Jewish, is one of the co-authors of the book, because she is, if I say she's an amateur genealogist, that does her a disservice, but I can't call her a professional genealogist because she's not paid. She used to be in the HR department of the mining industry. When she retired, she got bored, so she became the HR department of the Museum of the Revolutionary Movement, or something similar in Ostrava, and then retired from that and got totally bored, so thought she would investigate the genealogy of her family, which took about an hour and a half, because she said there's nothing very interesting in a family at all. So she decided to do her husband's, which is much more interesting. He's got a big family spread out, a much more interesting history. And then somebody else said, while you're doing that, will you do our history? Somebody else and somebody else. And suddenly she is a world authority on the genealogy of the Jews of Ostrava. And she's fantastic. And she and I do a sort of synergy, because she speaks Czech beautifully. And that restricts her activities, and she doesn't travel very much. So whatever there is to know about the Jews in Ostrava, she knows or will find out. And I'm in contact with worldwide Jews because I speak English and use the web. So I will get in touch with her to say, I've just heard from Moshe Cohen about his father and family. And within 2 days, she'll come back and say, oh, yes, his grandpa had a chip shop and his great-grandpa did this. And I've got his school report. So there are people still. There are 2 memorials to the Jews of Ostrava deported during the war. So the Ostrava city is very conscious of having lost its Jews and is anxious to rebuild.
You asked me to juxtapose the 2 photographs. You showed one of them. What is the second one on the poster?
That's the Czech Scrolls Museum.
Yes, it's the one on the right-hand side.
That's the Jewish school in 1942. You can see they're all wearing stars. And within a few months, they were all murdered, which is why I show the other one.
You said the cemetery's been now used something else. What happened to all the headstones?
They were moved to a new Jewish cemetery on the Silesian side of the border. So there's a new cemetery with the old headstones sort of lined up against the wall. However, my colleague, Lou Busher, whom I just mentioned, went to the trouble of mapping the old cemetery before it was destroyed. So she has a map of all the individual graves.
What's there now?
It's a park.
I'd now like to call on Stuart Kurtz to propose the vote of thanks.
So, David, thank you very much for it. I think it was a very interesting talk. I've been hearing about this book for months and months and months. We're actually related through my wife. But it's very interesting to actually see the end product itself. I'm sure everybody enjoyed themselves, and on behalf of the Federal Synagogue, I'll come and join you and drink it. Thank you very much indeed. Where's Judith?